Okay, so that's kind of the broad outline in memory. Much of what we know about memory comes from mistakes that people make. We've talked about already confabulation, which is schema-based errors. So the structure about how the world is. And again, Korsakoff's is a classic case of this. A great study by Bartlett back in the 30s, almost 100 years ago now, was centered around this tale, this children's tale called War of the Ghost. And people were asked to read this passage. And I think they were hunting, I can't even remember now, it's kind of great, reconstructive memory. They were either hunting seals or beavers, and they were out in canoes doing this. But anyway, the subjects were asked to list all the details they could of the entire story. And what they would do is they would make simple mistakes. Like they'd say, well, they were in a boat instead of a canoe. They were hunting beavers instead of seals, or vice versa. Reconstructing and in the process making errors. And one of the big ones here, eyewitness testimony. One of the all-time great psychologists, certainly one of my heroes, Elizabeth Loftus, has done a great deal to debunk eyewitness testimony as a reasonable bit of evidence in court. And she also completely dismantled the idea of reconstructive memory, or not reconstructive, but these recovered memories. So the idea that you have some memory so horrible that you're going to shove it out of your brain. So that's errors that can get made. A second kind of error after confabulation is memory bias. And this is one, it's really fascinating. It has to do with how your memories change over time so that you can incorporate new information and so they become consistent with your current beliefs. You've maybe had this circumstance where you're talking to an old friend, or you're listening to your brother or your sister recall some family experience, and you're going, no, that's just not the way that happened. And what's going on is just we reshape these memories. Remember, memory's reconstructive in nature. And because it's not high fidelity, you can add whole new parts into there. You can move things around in time. Things that you would just as soon forget, guess what? You often do. And you know that conversation you have with yourself after an argument where you say, oh man, I should have said? If you just think about that long enough, there's a good chance your memory in 10 years will be you were that clever, articulate person, not the one standing there going, ba-deep, ba-deep, ba-deep. So our memories are not good representations. So why in the world would we have schema-based memory if there's so many errors that can fall into it? Well, it's more efficient than a high-fidelity, one-to-one recording. Just to give you some idea of how much, think about how many of you have iPods? And do you keep buying ones with more space? No, are we now to the point that iPods have enough space, or you're that broke? You're that broke, okay. So, the whole thing about computers since their inception has been, you'll buy this new one, you're like, I can remember going, I will never fill up a 4 gig hard drive in my life. I can remember that. And then it was an 8 gig, and then a 16 gig. My laptop has, I think, some goofy, like 100 gig. It's weird. I don't even know how much it has. And I'm going to fill that puppy up. Schematic memory is sort of like when you zip a file, you're using less. Or you remember the Gestalt psychologist, and they would have like that picture of the Dalmatian that's just little splotches, but you can see the Dalmatian to make them. That's how your memory's actually working. It's taking few pieces and letting you reconnect dots. So it's more efficient. It takes up less space. And what we do is we fill in the gaps between what we actually remember with what's plausible. So if you're sitting in that classroom, in that office upstairs, getting ready to go in to do your test, you go, oh, I was in an office, so there must have been all these things. You fill in plausible information. That's what I believe to be the case. So we do get problems, though, things like recovered memories. This makes for great movies. It's lousy psychology. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. We've talked about it before. But the classic cases from the 90s that Elizabeth Loftus was so good about experimentally debunking was all these children who their therapist had become convinced that they were sexually molested as children and inadvertently, through hypnosis, had implanted false memories. Recovered memories are really just quite implausible. Repression is the idea that you have memories, but you're actively repressing them. Those have been largely debunked. We've talked about this. So let's think about this idea that a memory is so horrible you just won't be able to recall it. Were that the case, we should have been able to find Holocaust victims with no memory of the events. So far as I know, there's no example anywhere of a Holocaust victim who doesn't remember. So far as I can tell, there are no cases of prisoners of war who were tortured and all kinds of bad things happened to them who don't remember. So it's an intriguing idea that we can have repressed memories, and God knows Freud loved them, but the evidence simply is not there. A final type of memory that you need to watch out for is the so-called flashbulb memory. And flashbulb memories are those memories that are paired, that come out of highly emotional events. So I bet every one of you can envision in your mind's eye the Twin Towers being hit by at least one plane. That is a highly charged emotional event, and we have vivid memories of those things. But here's the problem. Very often, these very vivid memories that we are very confident in are wrong. Just because they're vivid and you're very confident in your memory does not mean that it's a correct memory. When I was in grad school, I took an entire semester course on memory, and it was really funny because that's when 9/11 happened, during that, like a year or two before I had this course. And the guy teaching the course says, I remember very clearly, Tiffany and I were over at, and she's in the class, and she's going, no, that's not how that happened. Oops. So the guy teaching it, apparently, and we got to thinking, and kind of between us, we thought, yeah, we don't think that's right. But then at that point, we're going, well, memory sucks, so are we all wrong, and is he right? But the idea is there are memories around very emotionally charged situations, very vivid, not necessarily correct. Neisser and Harsh, in 1992, after the Challenger explosion, had people write down within days these essays about what they were doing, where they were at, who they were with, just how things kind of played out, what their memories were of the Challenger explosion. And they came back sometime later and asked them to do the same thing again. So you can imagine a year after the Challenger explosion, you're like, okay, remember what happened. It was remarkable in that study how different the account right after the fact and the accounts a year later were. And it has to do with the reconstructive nature of memory. All right. So let's talk a little bit about amnesia. Amnesia is the failure of memory. It's to not be able to retrieve things that were encoded. And there's two major types. There's retrograde and anterior grade amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is amnesia for events that occurred prior to the brain insult, be that an injury or a surgery in HM's case. So retrograde memories, you don't know what happened before. So this is the kind of memory that you'll always see in the movies. Somebody wakes up somewhere where they don't belong. They don't know who they are. They don't know what's going on. It's the kind of memory I hope for memory loss I hope for every Thanksgiving as I visit with family. So far, no luck. And anterior grade amnesia is a loss of memory for events following. So the big difference here is going to be when the events are that you do not have memory for.
Is that like a 51st stage where your grandma couldn't remember anything anymore? She just had that span of a day?
You know, I would love to be able to answer that question. And every semester for the last 2 years, people have asked me, and I've just never seen the movie. But a good movie, as far as movie goes on memory, is Memento. If you've seen it, it's a little implausible on how the injury worked, but it's pretty good in terms of the short-term memory. I'm not sure how helpful the tattoos would have been, but also you remember where they're testing they're doing the insurance testing, and the guy's getting shocked if he picks up the wrong things. They're checking to see, does the guy have conditional learning left or not, all that. But 50 dates, yeah, I can't tell you about because I haven't seen it. And I don't feel much poorer for it. So let's revisit this idea to understand what's going on with HM and this retrograde amnesia. So insult is going to be an injury or the surgery, and we want to ask questions that will help us figure out how much does Henry remember. So you can do things like back at that time, Time magazine was kind of the Facebook of the day, except you just read what people were doing. But if you wanted to know who the movie stars were, well, TMZ, I think, is like kind of maybe an analogous thing. So all these kind of things, they would show HM pictures of people from these magazines, and they would also show people his same age these same pictures. So they could tell how much do people remember who are not injured, how much does HM remember. And so what they found out that was for the first 6 months leading up to the surgery, Henry just remembered very, very little. As you went further back in time, he starts remembering more and more and more and more, to where 10 years prior to his surgery, he remembered as well as non-injured. So what you're looking at on this graph is memory consolidation. You're looking at how memory goes from an electrical, just a temporal spatial firing pattern, to being synaptically encoded. When this injury or this surgery occurred, those circuits were disrupted. And these things that were most recent in time, he had no memory for. But further and further back, he had more and more memory for. That's called temporally graded. Temporally graded. So time-graded amnesia. But we see amnesia in a lot of conditions. Alzheimer's, dementia, is a form or one of the causes of amnesia. It has to do with damage in the forebrain. It's the loss of neurons that are using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And there are also what you'll hear called plaques and tangles, growths in the brain that honestly we don't account for well right now. We don't know why they're there. We don't know if they're just correlational or if they're causal. We just don't know, but those are what you have there. Alzheimer's disease marked by confusion. So think about if your memory's not good and your forebrain, that's where some of the working memory is going as well, it's going to be really hard to interpret what's going on from moment to moment. And that confusion also leads to irritability and anger. And you also see mood swings quite a bit. Inevitably, people ask about how to stem off memory failure. I have a pretty steady stream of 40-year-olds who approach me because they know I'm a neuroscientist and they're convinced that they're in early stages of Alzheimer's because they're having trouble remembering things as well as they could. So kind of my standard, how do you stave off memory loss? It turns out that these things are probably the best things you can do to keep your memory. Regular mental stimulation, good diet, and exercise. Shockingly, whiskey didn't make the list. I think that probably needs further study because you know whiskey translates literally into water of life. That's true. You learn something every day in this class, don't you?